can find code to delete, that's code you don't have to upgrade.
Welcome to the Ruby Rogues podcast. I'm Jason Sweat. Charles Max Wood is not here today. Here with us, we have Brian Hogan.
Hello.
We have Josh Wood.
Hey there.
And Ben Wood.
Hey, everybody.
By the way, probably no relation to Charles Max Wood, right?
Maybe. but none that I'm aware of.
Not that you know.
Chuck and I, we've talked about it, and I think we've decided that there's no relation there.
Yeah, just so people know, we're not like having just all Chuck's family members on the show. Okay, so you guys are from Upgrade Rails. What is that? Tell us about that.
So Upgrade Rails is a service that we started. So first of all, Ben and I were co-owners of a Ruby consultancy based out of Vancouver, Washington, which is it's right next door to Portland, Oregon. And we happen to be brothers, hence the last name. But Upgrade Rails is a service that we started specifically because we kept running into like a lot of clients that have Rails applications that need to be upgraded, but for whatever reason, like their teams usually, they want them working on features. They don't really want to stop and take time to do things like maintenance. Like it's not usually the top of people's list. So we created Upgrade Rails as kind of a service for us to develop our own expertise in. We feel that we can do it a lot faster and better than the typical team that doesn't do it all the time. And we can help teams focus on their features and building their Rails application in their business rather than doing maintenance.
So what kind of like clients and apps have you worked with so far?
So far we've upgraded CodePen.io, which was a lot of fun. They're kind of one of the better known sites on the internet. I think they have a really high Alexa rank, and they are a code sharing site. If you hadn't heard of them, really cool business and really cool people. So it was a lot of fun to work with them. We also we've recently finished an upgrade for Nation Builder, which is another pretty large Rails application. And I've known them for a little while, and they're also really awesome folks over there. So we typically, we work from anywhere from like small projects that might take anywhere from like a week to 2 weeks, all the way up to multi-month projects that are, stepping through from even Rails 2 all the way up to Rails 4, 4.2 or 5.
So I'm really interested to hear how this kind of goes, because I find your work a little bit terrifying, because you're like stepping into this unknown code base and you're going to upgrade their Rails version, and it's like there's some risk to that, right? Like you could potentially upgrade it, and since you're not familiar with all the features, you could accidentally break something. So like, how do you prevent against that kind of stuff?
Want to jump in there, Ben?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a process that we've been developing, and that absolutely is the question. And it is scary when you're getting into a Rails upgrade, especially in a code base that you're not familiar with. I want to add something to what Josh was saying about clients that we're working with before I dive into answering that question. That is that we're currently working on a project that will likely take a year or more to actually upgrade the entire, I say application, but actually there's like 4 applications. They're all Rails apps, and they're all interconnected, probably in ways that are not best practice, like some coupling happening and stuff. And so we're involved in this project to help our client basically get some footing and foundation, and then set them in the right path. And then they're going to be continuing on at some point beyond our involvement, because it would be expensive to have us, contract with them for a year or more, especially when they do have a large internal team. They're just needing some help. So yeah, we've got projects that, that take a week or two. Josh did the CodePen upgrade, and I believe like a week and a half or 2 weeks. Is that right, Josh? Like a week maybe?
Yeah, it was actually about a week exactly.
Yeah, and that's unusual to make it clear. Like most people that come, if they have a week-long budget, that's usually pretty ambitious. But it's not unheard of. If you've got a relatively healthy code base, and say you're going from Rails version 3 to Rails version 4, or Rails version 4 to Rails version 5, or something along those lines, it's not completely out of the picture that you'd be able to do something like that in a week. But we found that a lot of the projects that we get involved with, especially ones that are really far behind, it's not just a Rails upgrade that they're in need of. It's usually, if you've made it 10 years without upgrading Rails, then there's a really good chance that there's some just some chronic illness in your app. You've got some serious tech debt going on. It's eating away, and it's not just dependencies, framework and
So
other gems and stuff that need updating. Yeah, well, excuse me. That's usually where we start. And that's why I wanted to kind of preface with that is that it is scary jumping into an application, and most people's approach to starting a Rails upgrade is, well, I guess we should get into the gem file and change the Rails version and try to resolve all the dependencies, and then just start dealing with stuff as it comes and try to get the Rails console to boot or something along those lines. And we've definitely taken that route before. In our consultancy before we really, I would say, became experts, or before we built expertise in this area, we took that most basic and naive approach. And I can definitely say it's not the way to go, because you absolutely do get lost in the upgrade. You end up in a place where so many things are broken at once that it's like you're treading water and you're trying to swim out of it.
Do you have to kind of limit the kinds of clients you work with? Because it seems like, different people have different mindsets, and not everybody understands that you might have to make some initial investments in paying down some technical debt before you can justifiably work on an upgrade project, because otherwise it's just going to be impossible. So how do you deal with that?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question, and I would say we don't limit the clients necessarily. I would say that we will limit our involvement if we're in the scenario where a client has a lot of technical debt that they need to pay down, and we're advising them, hey, that's not a good idea to try to start a Rails upgrade project right now before you deal with some of this stuff. Mm-hmm. Like, for example, say you've got 30% of the code base isn't even used because there's a bunch of code that hasn't been touched in years and also hasn't been removed. And we would essentially say, hey, here's a list of things that we observe that need to be done, and we can help you with this. And we would work with them to pay down some of that technical debt before we dive into an upgrade project. So, for example, in that project I was saying that's probably going to go on for a year or more, their current production version of Rails that they're running is Rails 2.3. And they upgraded from Rails 1 back in 2009. I think they did that upgrade. They're on Ruby 1.8.7, and they have a mountain of technical debt that they need to deal with before they can realistically engage in an upgrade. Now, when we came to them and got started, we had our kickoff call and discovered that they actually started doing the Rails upgrade already. They dove into it, which was, it's hard to be disappointed when you hear from them that, hey, we got, Rails console booting. Yet at the same time, it's like, well, wait a second, it's great that you've made some progress, but you're going to have to step back at some point and deal with this other stuff, because, and we're already finding out, we're in the project now. And so we're finding out, okay, we're lost in this, with this thing that came up as unexpected. Some stuff that we're familiar with because of doing past, Rails upgrades, but for them, stuff is coming as a surprise. and thus it's more difficult to deal with.
I'm interested in hearing a lot about those kinds of surprises that you find, because I can imagine that's the real value that you bring, isn't it? You bring that experience of having worked on it, whereas the development team who's upgrading that application, they may only, they have the experience of upgrading that application, but you've seen stuff, man. You've seen things, right?
We've seen some things. That's true.
We got that crazy look in our eyes, or bloodshot eyes and all that.
Yeah, right. I mean, like the gem they were depending on that no longer exists and has to be replaced with a brand new one with a completely different API. Those kinds of things,
right. Yeah, absolutely. One such example of that actually, in Rails 2 to Rails 3, there was if you're looking at the change logs, you would think it's a minor change, and that is the default behavior of a string, which has a concept of being HTML safe. In Rails 3.0. In Rails 2.3, there's no such thing. All strings were considered HTML safe. But if you've ever been working in a Rails application and you've had a string that you ended up seeing escaped when it displayed in your browser, i.e. you're actually seeing HTML instead of seeing, the result of the HTML visually. you need to call HTML, you need to call HTML safe on the string, or you need to say raw and then pass the string to it for it to display properly. Well, that's something that was introduced in Rails 3, didn't exist in Rails 2. And so there's a lot of people that have Rails 2 applications where they're not, or I should say where they need to do work to ensure that their strings are not HTML escaped by the time it hits the browser. And that's something that, like, if you've ever done a Rails 2 upgrade, it's probably, I can't imagine that you didn't run into that at least a few times. In the application that we're upgrading right now, that's one of the things that they've hit. They're just like, we're not sure why we have to say raw, on this, and it's escaping everything. And so one of the things I wanted to mention about this is that in the changelog, or I should say in the Rails 3.0 release notes, there's actually just a little bullet point under, let's see, this is actually under the action view section, 7.4. And then down in 7.4.3 category called other changes, there's a bullet point that says you no longer need to call string, parentheses string, to escape HTML output. It is only it is on by default in all view templates. If you want the unescaped string, call raw and then pass a string to it. And as far as I know, at least that's where in the changelog it says, hey, there's this thing that you need to consider when you're upgrading. And yet it's this huge thing. It's like one of the main things when you're upgrading from Rails 2 to 3 that you end up having to account for, and you end up touching a lot of files, touching a lot of code to resolve those issues, So that's, and I
would say the biggest problem with that is that it fails everywhere and it fails silently. So unless you have if you have really strong integration tests or something like that, or like you have like a Cucumber suite or something like that that's actually like testing the output, maybe even running JavaScript enabled on those tests, then you're going to have a bunch of failing tests. But if you don't have those tests, then basically it's just you're going to constantly be running into pages that just don't display properly. And and it's not like you can go and I don't think there's even like a deprecation log for those just because it's just strings. So yeah, it's kind of a complicated issue.
Yep.
Would you think it's safe to say that a majority of the projects that you undertake don't have complex test suites like that?
Right. Yeah, that's actually a really good question. Just in terms of what do we see when people come to us, excuse me, their test suites. I would say for people that are really far behind in their gem versions, Rails version, for the most part, have not had extensive test suites. It doesn't mean that they don't have any, but for us to see 50 or 60% coverage is usually pretty good. If we see less than 50% coverage, then it's kind of, we're going to have one of those conversations where it's like, we want to work with you and we can help you extend your test coverage, but we don't really advise embarking on this until you build up some coverage. Not to say that 50 or 60% is ideal, because it's definitely not. I mean, a much higher number. And then, of course, line count number only tells you so much, right? Like that, those tests are, as many of us know, somewhat of a lie. I mean, it's a good metric, I guess, to help you judge on a some basis where your test coverage lies. But especially when you're dealing with legacy applications that have seen a lot of different hands in the code base, have not been very well maintained, maybe have had people drop in that are new to Ruby development and maybe programming in general, you end up with stuff like really, 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 really long lines of code, And so you might have one line that you missed in coverage that ends up being like the majority of the complexity of a method. So not that I need to get into a rant about that, but my point is we kind of try to take each case, uniquely and judge what the risk is based on not only how many lines of code they have covered, but also what their tests are like, if they're well written, if the critical parts of the apps are tested. If you've got 50% test coverage and you're testing all the least critical stuff, that's much different than having 50% test coverage and you're testing all the most critical stuff. So for example, if you've got a SaaS site or something like that, would hope that you'd have some test coverage inside of your subscription system. And not, maybe there's some some static pages or something that you decided not to test. But yeah, we get a lot of clients that do not have 100% test coverage or anything close to it, and we work with them to judge that risk and then sometimes extend the test coverage before we get started on a Rails upgrade.
So here's another question, not super related to that, but it popped into my mind a minute ago. We're on Rails 5 today. And it sounds like you might be dealing with some clients who are on like Rails 2. So how do you deal with that? Or even if it's Rails 3, like anything that's earlier than Rails 4, basically, it would take more than one version upgrade to get them up to 5. Do you do just like one notch and say, okay, that's good for now, and then maybe at some point in the future we'll take another pass? Or do you try to do it all at once, or how do you approach that?
Yeah. So usually what the scenario is when somebody's coming up to us and they're on an older version, there's not very many people that are saying, hey, we're on Rails 2 and we really just want to get to Rails 3. In fact, we haven't had that happen yet, actually. If you're on Rails 2 and you're looking to upgrade, it's typically because you're saying, hey, we're like way outside of any kind of community support on Rails, and thus we're out of security support. So if there's, security patches that are being made, they're not getting applied, not only to Rails 2, but they're not getting applied to Rails 3. In fact, they're not even getting applied to Rails 4 or 4.1. Currently, only Rails 4.2 and Rails 5 are getting security patches, and the rest of previous versions of Rails are completely unsupported. So people that are on on an older version of Rails, like Rails 2, are usually coming to us and saying, hey, what's the lowest version of Rails that has security support? Can you help us get there? So in the case of this project that we're working on right now, that's going to be a year or more, what they're after is PCI compliance. They are looking to have some security certifications. In order to do that, they need to make sure that they've shored up the foundation, so to speak, and upgrading Rails and Ruby, and also, for example, their production environments version of Linux and such is something that they're doing. And to answer the other part of your question, it's not just one step. We also, we don't jump from Rails version 2 to Rails version 4.2. We take them from Rails version 2.3. We would go to then 3.0, and then we'd go to 3.1, and then we'd go to 3.2, and so on and so forth, 4.0, 4.1, and then to eventually to get to 4.2. So we don't step through all the security patch versions, but we do step through each minor version. The reason for that is that you get deprecation warnings. You get to get the application to a stable place between each step. If you try to make a big leap between versions, we found that again, you end up in that limbo space where everything's broken all the time, and you're kind of lost in it, and you're treading water. So that the ideal is to basically bite off as little pieces as you can chew at a time, and get things into a stable state, and hopefully even get some stuff into production. For example, again, in this, I keep going back to this example because it's the project that we're working on right now, but we are planning to release a version on Rails 3.2, and they're not going to stay at that version, but we actually want to release it in the production environment and verify that, yes, this is stable.
I was going to ask about that.
If any issues pop up,
it sounds like you do.
We don't deploy each one, but we do choose ones that we want to deploy depending on what versions we're going in between. Typically, it's going to be the last release of a major version. So in the case of this upgrade that we're doing, if we're going to be going through the Rails 3 versions, we're not going to release 3.0 or 3.1, but we are going to release the very last patch version of 3.2.
Gotcha.
Yep.
Let's take a break from this episode and really quickly talk about finding a job. Searching for a job can feel stressful, scary, and time-consuming. Pushy recruiters try to sell you on roles you don't actually want, and the job boards make you feel like you're throwing your resume into a black hole, never to be seen again. And sometimes you go all the way through an interview process just to find out that the very end that the salary offer or company culture doesn't match what you're looking for. Well, there's a solution. Hired.com is the world's most intelligent talent matching platform for full-time and contract opportunities. They make the job search faster, focused, and stress-free instead of endlessly applying to companies and hoping for the best. Hired puts you in control of how and when you connect with compelling opportunities. And after completing one simple application, top employers apply to you. And the best part is that you get money. That's right. They pay you if you get a job through them. Listeners to this show can earn double their normal hiring bonus by signing up with the show's link. That's right. You get $2,000 instead of $1,000. So go sign up at hired.com/RubyRoguesPodcast.
I would add one thing. When you're deciding what your upgrade path is going to be, and like Ben said, typically that's, you're stepping from, minor release to major release, and then between major releases, you don't want to just jump straight from like 2 to 4. I would say there is one case where I might consider doing that, and I think you have to evaluate these on a case by case basis. But if you say you're on like a Rails 2.3 and your app is relatively small, it can make sense, time wise and budget wise. It can actually cost you less if you decided to, jump straight to Rails 5, for instance, from Rails 2.3. The only caveat there is that you would have to, that's more akin to a like a rewrite, or at least a port directly to that version. So you're going to be dealing with a lot more things where you're like rewriting certain things maybe because you don't have all the deprecation warnings. You just know that it's the wrong code and it needs to be upgraded. So that's like something to judge on a case by case basis. But I have seen that work really well, mainly for small code bases, small Rails apps. That it just it is a big process to step between all the Rails versions, and sometimes it's actually less time to just go straight. But like I said, you just have to kind of do a cost analysis for that, and then choose whichever one is going to cost you less.
Yeah. Yep, and I can add something onto the end of that as well, and that definitely is an option. And as Josh said, sometimes it can end up costing less. The considerations are things like, if you're on Rails 2.3, then there's a chance that you're not using tooling for your test suite that you're going to want to use, or that is even compatible by the time you get to Rails 5 and Ruby 2.3. And so that means that you can't port the application and then say, okay, like now let's run our tests and see what passes. You've got to do work on your test suite and maybe swapping out your tooling, migrating over to something like Minitest or ParseSpec from Test Unit or whatever it is that you were using back then. And that's tricky because you've lost your ability to say, okay, we've made this step and we've upgraded things. Now we're going to run our tests. Where if you're doing the processes, you're walking through the versions, you might make it to Rails 3. And then say, okay, before we move on to Rails 4, we're going to actually take some time to migrate our tooling that we're using in our test suite to something that is also compatible on Rails 3, but is also going to be compatible on Rails 4 and beyond. And you can run the test one by one as you're converting them and see that, okay, this is still testing the same thing. We're not changing the behavior of the test and what it's testing. That's tricky when you make those big leaps. But as Josh said, in the right scenario, it can still be the right choice. And it is kind of like a rewrite almost, because for reasons like that, you have to consider things like, okay, we actually have to almost rewrite our tests and really look at each one and see that what its intention was, what it was testing, but it's still testing that, at least in spirit, on this latest version that we've jumped to.
I'm interested in some of the things that you've said, some of the things you've alluded to. So I'm going to ask a kind of a direct question to try to pull it all together, which is what. You're talking about people that are coming from versions of Rails that are quite old now. Yeah. So what do you suppose, what are the top reasons that people have put this off? I mean, we can say lack of manpower and wanting to focus on things, but are there some other reasons that that people will just kind of maybe defer this? What are some of the reasons that you've heard from customers or clients?
Yeah. Josh, do you want to answer that, or you want me to
go? Go for it.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, I think that there's probably a number of reasons, but the most common that we see is that, like I said, that, they're not just deferring. This is being real honest. They're not just deferring the Rails upgrade. They're deferring, maintenance and health checks on their application. And so, in my opinion, I think in most cases, the reason that they're as far behind as they are is just a lack of oversight in the health of the code base in general. And that's not the case in every scenario. There have been some upgrades that we've done that are not that. But, usually those upgrades they're not the ones that are on Rails 2. They're on Rails 3 or something. And they've said, well, we had security support and stuff until fairly recently. And now we realize, it's time for us to bite the bullet and take this on. And so sometimes it's funding, that might have kept them from diving into it. Sometimes it's features that they're working on, or infrastructural stuff that's important. For example, I think I can say this. When we worked on Nation Builder, one of the reasons that they brought us in is that their whole team was very focused on beefing up their infrastructure for the election season, because Nation Builder is all about building tools for political activism political parties to have mailing lists and donations and all sorts of features like that, right? So around election time, once every 4 years, they get basically just slammed, and their infrastructure, if they're not up to the challenge, will just crumble underneath the weight of it. So their whole team was focused on that. Yet at the same time, they're saying it's really important and valuable for us to get up to a more current version of Rails. So that what I would say is, a scenario that isn't quite that, like it's just been neglected. It was put off for a time, and then they realized, we need to have somebody help us get this done, because we're going to continue to put it off because we've got these other super high priorities that is consuming all of our time. And so, yeah, the other scenario is often just that there hasn't been that oversight to see, hey, we're building up technical debt, we're not paying it down, and at some point it's going to come back to bite us, to the point that they might hire somebody like us, and we're saying, hey, this is going to take you a year, maybe, with a small team. We're not talking about putting 20 people on it, but if you've got a couple of people working on it and you're paying down all this technical debt, it might take you a year by the time you get through all the technical debt and then step through the Rails version stably and get them into a production environment.
So do you suppose, I was wondering if it's more like, if you've encountered people who are more have like a sort of a fear of the process, a fear of the upgrade, sort of like people who put off going to the dentist, for example. They're they're afraid of the pain and they don't really want to face it, and they're just kind of putting it off as long as they possibly can. Not necessarily oversight, but more of a direct, I'm using some really old gems, and I noticed they're no longer being maintained, so we'll have to swap out all of these things and things like that. That's another thing I was wondering about.
I think that's a very commmen case. I think a lot of people know that they need to be doing this stuff. Upgrading it's almost kind of like exercising. Like, everyone knows they should be doing it, but it's hard. It takes a lot of discipline to do it regularly, and it's just it's a lot easier not to do it. So I think it's a lot of people end up in that situation, and so like they know they need to do it, and it's just whether it's the fear or just not wanting to have to dedicate the time and the resources to it, and it just gets pushed back.
Yep, and I'll also add to that point that it definitely is sometimes a fear of what will happen if they do upgrade. If from past experiences they've learned that upgrading can be painful, not just in the process of getting it done, but also in the process of failing. Because we've definitely seen that before. Customers come and say, hey, I really, really, really don't want to upgrade because, fill in the blank, and they give a story about how the last upgrade was a huge failure and they had a lot of issues in production, et cetera, et cetera. But I know that it has to be done, and so, or they might be saying, and I put it off this long because of how afraid I am, but I finally come down to it. I need to do it. So that definitely is a scenario that happens as well. In addition to just being afraid of embarking on the work because it's so much and nobody likes to do it, it's also sometimes I'm afraid of what this is going to actually do to my application. Is it going to damage our business? Things of that nature.
So
all right,
how do you find the? Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say. So what I was going to say is how do you know when it's time to upgrade? How do you know? I mean, you don't want to just jump on the latest version that comes out, right? But how do you know? How do you strike that balance? How do you know when it's time to upgrade?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say, at the very least, when you see some updates coming from the Rails community that the next minor version of Rails is coming out, and that has implications for what version of Rails is going to be no longer supported for security patches. If you're on that version, or version before, that's definitely a time to upgrade. I would advise to everybody not necessarily to be on the bleeding edge of Rails necessarily, not that I'm against that, but that's not a requirement, but to at least keep within security support of the Rails core team is at least a that's a good rule of thumb, I guess I could say. And so when it comes to deciding, if you're going to jump to the next version of Rails, if it's the current version, really I say it's just a matter of, are there things that you want? Are there features that are going to benefit your business? That's going to benefit your developers as they build things? Is it going to speed up your processes? In most cases, I would say probably. It doesn't mean that you have to use, Action Cable or something like that. There's plenty of other things in Rails 5 that would increase productivity and, smooth the process of feature development, that sort of thing. So I would recommend it, but it's definitely not like, hey, you're not on the latest version of Rails, you got to get there immediately. We're not trying to preach that to people per se.
So you're sort of saying right now to everybody who's listening, if you're on Rails 4. If you're not on Rails 4.2 yet, it's probably time to have those conversations.
Absolutely, yeah. If you're on a version prior to Rails 4.2, then you should be thinking about it, because one, you're getting left behind, right? And you are building that technical debt that eventually is going to be difficult to get out of, because you've got multiple versions of Rails to go through. When Rails 5.1 comes out, if you want to get up to date, you're going to have to go through Rails 4.2 and 5.0 and then get all the way to 5.1. So you're building up debt that is going to be more difficult just because it's piled up. But also, excuse me. But also, there's the security support factor, which maybe not everybody's concerned about the security side of things, but I would say you should be.
Well, I might also add that
Mm-hmm.
if you're on like a creaky old Rails 3 code base, you might have a harder time attracting and retaining talent, right? Nobody wants to work on like a crappy old code base.
Absolutely. Yep. I would absolutely agree there that if you're having a hard time retaining good talent and you're using old tools and your code base has a lot of tech debt that you're not dealing with, you're not going to retain people to work on it because they're going to go find more interesting things to do. Certainly.
One other point that applies here. I don't know about you guys, but I like Stack Overflow a lot, and I think a lot of developers out there use Stack Overflow and similar documentation tools to supplement their memorized knowledge. And so one of the things that we run into is that the older the version of Rails that you're on, the more outdated the documentation is. And so it might take your developer, they might take them twice the amount of time to find the answer they need when they go and they Google something. They're going to they're not going to just pick the first result, for instance, that is usually what you would do if you're on kind of the most widely used version of Rails. But they're going to have to evaluate, like, what version is this? Maybe it's even, a couple of versions back they're looking for. So they have to find the right documentation or find the right question that was asked, back in 2009 or whatever. Yeah. So that alone, if you consider you're paying your developers either by the hour or for their time usually, that alone can save you a lot of money if you're the owner of an application, for instance. And I think that's always a pretty interesting thought to me. So that's something we like to think about too. Is like how can we save developers time, which translates into saving money for the business that they work for.
Yeah, that's absolutely a valid point, Josh. And I've got just a quick story about that. Just yesterday, I was doing some research as I was building out a upgrade roadmap for this client, which is a little different because normally, we're involved in the upgrade all the way through the process. In this particular upgrade, there's at least a good chance that we're going to be stepping out at some point. They're going to be continuing on. So we're building this really detailed roadmap for them, trying to download everything that we currently have in our own processes, internal stuff and wikis and whatnot, trying to put it into a document that they can have. And so just yesterday, I was reading an article that I think I got linked out of one of the Rails release, doc pages that was from the original author of Active Relation, AREL. And so I clicked the link and I'm reading it and I realized, hey, wait, this is on the Wayback Machine. Like, why is that? Can I access this still? And I found out, no, I can't. Like this blog article that I found extremely enlightening because I wasn't doing heavy Rails development at that time. I wasn't reading these sorts of articles, but now I'm very interested in to find out, like, okay, what was the original intent behind AREL? Who wrote it? And what was, why did they do this? That blog article literally doesn't exist on the internet anymore. It's on the Wayback Machine, and you can find it there, and that's awesome. I love the Wayback Machine for that. But there definitely is, as Josh was saying, this scenario where you don't have the resources that you had when the version was new. If you're on Rails 2, there was a lot of blog articles and documentation stuff going around the internet at that time that might just not even exist anymore.
Yep. So those are some pretty compelling sounding reasons to me to upgrade your Rails version, and that's helpful because like even I with obviously knowledge of Rails, it can be difficult to translate a Rails upgrade to like a really immediate, tangible ROI for all that time and expense and risk. But
Yeah.
those are like some pretty compelling reasons to pull the trigger and do it.
Yep.
So with these clients you work
Indeed.
with, how do you find each other? Do you find them? Do they find you? How does that work?
So you can find our website at upgraderails.com, and the main source that we've had for clients lately is we've been advertising in Peter Cooper's newsletter Ruby Weekly, and so we've been running some ads in there throughout I think since like around the spring of 2016, and so that's how we've met a lot of our clients. We also have we're a full service consultancy at Hint, so we do have we have clients. We get a lot of word of mouth clients. We have long-term clients that we've worked with that we also provide these types of services for. So we have the typical sources that you would expect for like a consultancy or an agency. A lot of word of mouth, but like I said, we're doing some advertising for UpgradeRails.com, and that's where we've found some of the clients we've been talking about.
And do those tend to be technical people who reach out to you?
Yeah, I find I've kind of been I'm kind of the marketing side is kind of my what I'm working on the most, and so I've kind of been targeting like the CTO level of a team that has probably 10 plus developers on it, sometimes a lot more. We do we work with some single founder types too. It doesn't that doesn't disqualify you if you don't have a large team. I just find that this kind of appeals a lot to like say you're a CTO and you're concerned about driving the technology forward, and you want people working on new features for the business and that sort of thing. You're the person that knows that this stuff needs to be done, but at the same time you're in that position where you don't necessarily want to stop everyone and work on it. So I think that's kind of how they end up finding us.
Awesome.
Hey, do you need a sanity check on your code? Make sure all the tests are passing. Make sure all the static assets compile. All the normal things that you need to do to make sure that your application is ready for production. Then you need continuous integration, and I recommend Snap CI. Snap CI is a product put together by our friends at ThoughtWorks, and it works great to pull all of your information together about your application, make sure it's ready for production, let your team know if it fails, and overall just make your life easier. So go check them out at snapci.com.
So it's probably pretty close to time to start getting to the picks, but anything we should touch on before we move on to that part of it?
Yeah. I'll just throw a couple things out there. One is just that we've been talking a lot about what we do with Upgrade Rails and what we've been doing for customers and stuff. But I hope that the conversation so far has been of benefit to people that are maybe in the situation that need to upgrade, and there's some advice that they can learn. One of the things which we didn't talk about, which I won't go into length with, but that is something that's part of our process that's just really valuable, and I would love to see people doing it when they're doing their own upgrades, is to try to do things that you can in advance. And we talked about that a little bit with like doing the tech debt thing, right? But there's certain things that you can take on before you actually touch your gem file. For example, we were talking earlier about that whole HTML safe thing with string between Rails 2 and 3. Well, there's a gem called Rails XSS that you can use in Rails 2 that will essentially give you the behavior of HTML string escaping in Rails 2. And the benefit of that is that you can say, hey, this is going to be a major challenge in this upgrade. And once we actually change our gem file and get Rails installed and all this stuff, there's going to be a lot of other things broken. A lot of tests are going to be failing for other reasons. And the benefit of taking care of this whole string escaping thing in a stable environment, your master branch on Rails 2 before you even touch your gem file again, is that it takes it out and you can work on that problem in isolation. If any of your tests fail, you know why. It's because of this string escaping thing. And you can even get it into production at some point and say, okay, let's see if we get any reports of issues, stuff that our tests didn't cover and our QA didn't catch. And then you can move on to the next thing. And the next thing might be use Bundler. Bundler wasn't used in Rails by default until 3.0, but you can use Bundler in Rails 2.3. And there's other things like that. And then with each step of upgrade, there's stuff like that on Rails 3 before going to 3.1, stuff you can do on 3.2 before going to 4.0. So that's a tool in our toolbox that would like to share with the world. And we definitely didn't come up with it. I think actually we maybe initially got the idea from a post about how GitHub upgraded from Rails 2.3 to 3.0, and that's one of the things that they did is they ported stuff from the next version back into the current version. And they actually took that to a whole nother level to the point that they ported everything back so that they could run Rails 2 or Rails 3 under the same code base, which is pretty nuts, but a very cool thing they did. And that's how they did it with zero downtime. So anyway, that's just a lesson we've learned that would definitely like to share. Look for opportunities to take things from the next version of Rails and pull them into your current version, resolve all the issues before you actually make that jump in your gem file. And then finally, I'd say, if you do end up in a situation where you need some help or extra expertise, we're definitely available. UpgradeRails.com to consult. If it's to ask us some questions and have us come on for a short period of time or have us come in for doing a whole upgrade, we're there.
Awesome. And yeah, I was just going to ask that, if somebody wants to do an upgrade themselves and maybe they don't have the budget to hire somebody for help or anything like that, are there any particular resources you'd recommend, or can they just email you a question, or what would you recommend to people?
Yeah, I'll answer that. I suspect Josh may have something to say about that as well. Honestly, there's something that I think is kind of silly, but is definitely something I must recommend, which is that there's these upgrade docs, right? And the tendency for people is to jump into the upgrade and start seeing what issues come up and then go read the docs and see if the problem that they're having relates to the issue or one of the issues that's inside of the upgrade docs. But I would say, before you embark on an upgrade, thoroughly read the upgrade docs. Not every little thing is covered in there, and certainly there's other issues that you're going to come into. For example, stuff that doesn't have anything to do with Rails, other dependencies and gems. But the tendency is for us as developers, often myself especially, is to skim read things. And I'm finally at the point where I feel like I've got a handle on all the changes, and that has given me an edge to connect the dots between things that might be interconnected. So there are resources out there. They're not too hard to find. The problem is actually getting yourself to read them thoroughly and not just skim over them before you get started. So
you're saying it's probably worth investing a little time to educate yourself and sharpen your axe before you chop down that tree.
Exactly.
Totally. Yeah. And I hope, I'm hoping that we're going to be able to do more, put more out there for the community, in the form of blog posts and that sort of thing of how we do our process. But really, like you said, that's really the benefit that we can provide, doing this all the time is that we, number one, we have experience. We have a lot more experience than the average team doing this, since it's primarily what we do. And we've also, we're building a process that is, I think, pretty unique to us. And it incorporates all that experience and, all the best practices that we've learned doing all these upgrades. And that really gives us an edge to be able to do the upgrades faster. And even if it wasn't faster, just to ensure their success and, not running into severe bugs and that sort of thing. I hope we can share more of that. And definitely, you can all, I'm happy to answer any emails that anyone would have about the upgrade process or, just giving advice. So you can always contact us at it's contact@hint.io, and happy to email.
Yep. Cool.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to transition us into picks. Ben, do you want to do your picks first?
Yeah, absolutely. So I picked 3 things, all actually relating to, I guess, maybe more tech debt than upgrading. Josh and I were just at RubyConf this last week, and these are 3 gems that I learned about, and I haven't actually had a chance to use in depth yet. So don't ask me too many questions, because I probably can't answer them. But I'm really excited to start using them. I think that we'll probably be able to make them part of our process, and I think people should check them out. So the first one is the Suture gem. And that's made by Justin Searles. It's github.com/test/suture. And it's a refactoring tool for Ruby designed to make it safe to change code that you don't confidently understand, which is a huge feat, not something that's easy. And we actually saw Justin give a talk on this and kind of demo how it's used. And I got to say, it seems like magic. The next one is called DeBride Gem. And this is from Seattle RB. I think actually, Ryan, actually, I'm not sure if that's correct about who the author is. But anyway, Seattle RB/DeBride. It's a static code analysis tool for finding potentially unused code or dead methods, which is definitely one of the things when you're embarking on upgrade. If you can find code to delete, that's code you don't have to upgrade. So I'd highly recommend doing that. The other one is also a tool for finding unused code. It's called Scythe, and I think it's a fairly new tool, actually, is my understanding. Static and code analysis of dynamic languages is not 100%, so you're not going to find all of your methods that are unused. You're also going to potentially have some false positives and such. So Scythe, I think, is a tool that's meant to kind of stand in the gap there, especially with a language like Ruby. And the idea is you would install it into your application, put it in your production environment, tell it to look at certain methods. You'd install, I think they call them probes. And what it does is it actually records to a database the number of times that this code path has been called, if it's been used at all in production, and it'll give you a date. And then there's a tool that will actually list out, hey, this method was called this many times, and here's when, that sort of thing. So if you have some code that, say, maybe DeBride had pointed out to you, or you're just suspicious that maybe it wasn't used, you could use Scythe in production to actually see if that code is being used or not over the course of, say, a week or a month. If you've got code that isn't touched in a month, then there's a really good chance it's never going to be touched, right? So those are my three. Pretty cool.
Yeah, those sound pretty useful. I'm going to go check those out. Josh, do you want to do your picks?
Sure, yeah. My picks aren't related to upgrading particularly. They're just things I like. But my first one is the JRuby Truffle project by the Oracle, which I think is really cool. So JRuby, JRuby, if you don't know, it's an implementation of Ruby for the JVM. Some benefits include multi-threaded concurrency, and it's really fast compared to MRI. So some folks over at Oracle have been working on an alternate interpreter and compiler for JRuby, and it's a lot simpler, and apparently it's 10 to 20 times faster than MRI, or it will make JRuby 10 to 20 times faster. So I thought that's really cool. It's not, it doesn't sound like it's for production use yet. It's experimental, but I think it's a really neat project to follow. There was recently a talk on it at a RubyConf last week, and I think we're gonna link to a website for it in the show notes that has like a bunch of research papers and that sort of thing. So there's a lot to dive into. So my next pick is actually old ThinkPads running Linux. This has kind of been a hobby of mine lately, and I've been having a lot of fun with it. So ThinkPads, it's a line of laptop by Lenovo. It was previously by IBM, and Lenovo bought them. The cool thing about ThinkPads is that you can buy them really cheap with pretty decent specs. A lot of people upgrade them. My favorite thing about them is that you can, if you have if you have no hardware expertise, you can upgrade them yourself. And so it's a lot of fun, and it's a fun way to learn Linux, which I've been doing lately. So they run Linux really well, and like I said, like for example, I wanted to upgrade my screen to a better resolution in my one of my ThinkPads, and so I just bought the parts and was able to follow the hardware manual that came with it and do it myself. So that was a lot of fun, kind of like a weekend project. And my last pick is actually, I don't think I mentioned this, but I'm also the co-founder of Honeybadger.io, which is an exception tracking application for Ruby specifically. And one of my co-founders, Star Horn, who writes a lot of our blog posts, wrote a really interesting blog post on, it's called A Rubyist Guide to Big O Notation. So that's kind of a computer science concept. It's Big O notation is a mathematical notation that's commonly used for describing the complexity of an algorithm. And Star does a really good job of describing that in kind of Ruby terms. So if you haven't heard of Big O notation, go check that out. Again, I think we'll have a link in the show notes. And those are my picks.
Awesome. Brian?
I've got two that are tangentially related to the things we've been talking about today. The first one that I've got is a book called Eat That Frog, 21 Great Ways to Stop Procrastinating and Get More Done in Less Time. It's by Brian Tracy, and it makes the assumption that if you have to wake up every morning, you should do the most uncomfortable or most difficult thing first. And if you're talking about people who are maybe putting off the Rails upgrade, just remember that that frog is going to keep staring at you over and over again until you eventually take care of it. And the other pick that I have is related to the previous pick, which is about big O notation. And one of the things that I personally believe is important is to keep your skills sharp, keep your skills where they need to be. And one of the things that I have been advocating for and practicing every day is some exercises over at codefights.com. Codefights gives you some challenge problems, and you can actually do them against other software developers, either timed, and see who can solve the problem quicker. There's some great bots to practice against, but it's a lot more fun to do it with your coworkers and really challenge each other to keep up your skills.
Awesome. And I'm going to continue my tradition of having picks that have nothing to do with anything. So my first pick is this. I don't know what the heck it is. I just found it somehow. It's called Basics of Mechanical Engineering by this guy named Paul D. Roney, Ronney. And I Googled the guy out of curiosity, and it showed him in a spacesuit. I don't know who this guy is, but this guide is just really great. It's a really accessible guide to really accessible intro to mechanical engineering, which is something I happen to have an interest in. I play Legos with my kids, and I like to try to build contraptions with Lego Technic, and I figured it would be useful to go and learn some actual mechanical engineering fundamentals.
Nice.
So that has been really cool. And then my other thing is a book by Carl Sagan called The Demon Haunted World. And it's just kind of about it's about how to know what's true and what's not true. Talks about some interesting stuff to do with the Reagan administration, which was kind of, I think the book was written in the 80s. Talked about how the Reagans used to consult astrologers and stuff like that to make really important decisions, and just kind of how we as a society can avoid that kind of hocus pocus. And so I thought that was a really interesting book. Again, nothing to do with anything, but kind of interesting. Okay.
Cool.
Well, I want to say thanks, Josh and Ben, for coming on the show. It's been really informative and helpful. And if you could just repeat where people can find you online, and if you want to include like Twitter handles or anything like that, feel free. But just to make sure people have the right way to contact you, can you share that again for us?
Sure, yeah. So you can find our consultancy, which is called Hint, at hint.io. You can find Upgrade Rails at upgraderails.com. And you can find Honey Badger at honeybadger.io. If you need exception tracking, I'm Joshua P, all lowercase, all one word, on Twitter. And Ben, you can drop your Twitter handle.
Yeah, I'm Benjamin Wood on Twitter. All one word, Benjamin Wood.
Awesome. Well, I think that's a wrap. Thanks again.
All right, thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for having us.